Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on examining scholar perspectives on academic publishing. I am Danielle Cooper. I am an applied social scientist with a not-for-profit that specializes on issues pertaining to libraries, scholarly communications, and museums called Ithaca. And wait, did I hear something in the audience?
I think it's just people outside.
It's people in the hall. And I am joined today with my colleague, Christine Wolf-Eisenberg, who is the manager of surveys and research at Ithaca. We will be aiming for interactivity and reflection on our session. If you do not have a handout, please raise your hand, and JoJo will be making sure the rest of you get one. As JoJo goes around, I will mention that she is the Manifold Graduate Fellow and working on her PhD in English at the Graduate Center at CUNY. We have Angela Gibson, who is a director of scholarly communication for the Modern Language Association, and Lisa Hinchliffe, who is a professor and coordinator for information literacy and instruction at Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So we are doing this session because here at SSP, there is so much talk about thinking about how to incorporate the needs and perspectives of scholars into how we do our work. I've been really encouraged to see at this iteration of the conference how many panels incorporate scholars on them and really working towards getting scholarly perspectives. And hats off to the SSP organizing committee for really making that a priority of this iteration of the conference to achieve a diversity of perspectives in that respect. At Ithaca SNR, we do this work as part of our research. We are engaging with scholars regularly to try to understand their perspectives on scholarly communications. And so we are here today to think through with you where scholars are at on key issues pertaining to scholarly communications. So I begin with a question which is at the top of your handout. It is a moment for you to think yourself from where you're at as a stakeholder in scholarly communications about where you think scholars are at on these issues, the key issues in scholarly communications. Today we'll be focusing on open access, data sharing, and peer review. And the form has a couple of prompts to get you thinking about this. We invite you to consider how scholars' perceptions of these issues may differ from their actual practices and how these perceptions and practices may vary by the kind of scholar. So for example, if you're working at for a society that is for a particular field, you may be coming to this issue from the perspective of working with a very particular kind of scholar in one field, or if you're at a larger press and you have a number of titles in your portfolio, you may be able to make some comparisons across different fields. And so we also invite you to, when thinking about what your predictions are about where scholars are at, what informs your predictions? Your professional background, research you've recently read on the topic, and the like. So feel free to jot down some of your ideas on the form directly, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. And in the meantime, if anybody still does not have a form, please raise your hand. So we all come to these issues from different perspectives, and we wanted to pool perspectives with this panel. So now we're going to invite our three experts from different vantage points in scholarly communications to share their thoughts on where they think scholars are at in terms of these key issues relating to scholarly communications. So once again, we have Lisa, Angela, and JoJo. And does somebody want to start, or are we going in order?
JoJo start?
No.
I can just start at the very end.
Lisa, why don't you start?
Okay, apparently I'm starting. So I'm Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe. I'm the coordinator for information literacy services and instruction at the University of Illinois, as well as myself, a faculty member and a professor in library administration. So I've thought through these issues both as a librarian, as well as a scholar, and somebody who's currently the editor of a journal. So I think as I think through these sort of where do I think scholars' perceptions are on these key issues relating to scholarly communications, the first thing that comes to mind is to even ask myself the question whether scholars believe that these are the key issues with respect to scholarly communications. I think these are the key issues as we define them in many cases in the library and publishing community, but it might be interesting for us to ask ourselves whether these are the key issues for our scholars, because I hear scholars, if anything, more concerned with the ability to actually get their research done to start with, and then to find an audience for it. But if I take the question as given to focus on these things, I think we see a great variety of perspectives with respect to open access. We certainly have some faculty who are great advocates for this, although I think for them, they do not mean the business model of open access. They mean sort of a philosophical perspective and what they consider things to be open, and who does something have to be open for in order to be open access is also one of these great questions that we have to really grapple with. I think for many communities, data sharing scholars is not even particularly necessarily an issue, in the sense that what counts as data in different disciplines, whether even disciplines believe that they have data. I think there's a number of scholars who are like, I don't do data, and yet I think some of us would say everyone uses data. Peer review, I think everyone wants to be successfully peer reviewed, and most people would prefer not to be a peer reviewer to the extent that they can. That's an interesting conundrum of something that is, I think in many cases also valued as sort of the best among the most, like the best of the worst options for getting this process of vetting done, not because people love it, but because they've come to accept it. I think one of the other questions, if I could add to this, and I didn't speak so much to actual practices, so we'll leave that for others, but ask ourselves the questions as well of not only what are their perceptions on these issues, their practices, but also the gap between what their perceptions and actions are and what another player or stakeholder in the community would want them to be. Because I think sometimes our dialogue has to do with whether scholars hold the perceptions or act in ways that either librarians or publishers might want them to believe or act, versus really looking carefully at what people do believe and how they do act, and sort of engaging with the reality of it as opposed to sort of the gap between our sense of what they should want these things to be.
So I'm Angela. I work at the Modern Language Association, which is a membership society for language and literature scholars. And I've been working in various editorial capacities there for about 2 decades. And I sit on the editorial board of our flagship journal and also chair the publications committee for books. So I'm going to come at this with that background in mind. And I think you're exactly right, whether these are the key issues as defined by scholars, and that reach and audience is paramount for everyone I work with. In terms of open access, the scholars I work with have diverse attitudes and practices toward it. In part, that's because the MLA itself has a pretty broad-ranging publications program, from our sort of double or triple blind peer-reviewed flagship journal to our book publications program, to the MLA Commons, which is an online publication platform for born digital publications, where we do a kind of open form of review. I think very often I hear open access discussed, yes, as a business model, but also attitudes of scholars toward open access discussed in terms of generational differences. But I really see the differences break down in terms of career arc. In other words, the job secure versus the job insecure, or the job aspirational perhaps. And I was sort of surprised to hear repeatedly from established scholars that what they really want out of the publication opportunities they get is to have reach and influence, to impact an audience beyond the people they see every day in the halls of their institution. And so rightly or wrongly, they associate openness with the ability to reach those audiences. As publishers, we may know that many things get put online to die, so our responsibilities are to market that or bring it to the audience effectively. And in terms of contingent academics or academic early career scholars on a career path, they, as more established scholars, may see an ethical imperative around open access. There may be field-specific reasons why publishing openly makes sense, for example, in digital humanities with Born Digital Works, but there still is a concern about bias against open publications as well as potential ramifications for their career that we're still grappling with. So there's sort of incentives behind open publication or lack of incentives remain the issue of prestige and influence. And in terms of peer review, very quickly, again, some diverse practices around that. From where I stand, I see a lot of generosity in participating in the process because it takes a lot of time away from many other activities. But again, in talking to scholars, I see a variation in their experiences with peer review, which kind of has recently brought home to me the fact that it takes enormous resources to do it effectively and appropriately. At the MLA, we're fortunate that we have a sort of centrally managed process for that in terms of making sure the reports are kind and done in a timely way. But that doesn't happen everywhere. So that's an opportunity and a challenge for publishers, as well as perhaps for publishers or at the institutions where scholars are working to mentor future peer reviewers into knowing how to do that well and generously. So that's
all right. This is, I'm so excited to hear these perspectives. I'm Jojo Carlin, and I'm a graduate student at the Graduate Center CUNY. And I am also a participant on the Manifold Scholarship digital publishing platform, which is committed to open source and open access publishing. But I'm also on the editorial collective of the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy at the Graduate Center. So I have sort of fingers in a lot of different pots as a young scholar, seeing what openness has to do for me. And it's interesting to be in an English program, but also working in digital humanities, because I see my peers working from a place motivated by these concerns of the early career scholars to say, what is going to get us hired? And a lot of my friends and myself have come at it from an angle of the academic job market is less than desirable, and what are the ways we can market ourselves beyond that, and how to sort of like expand ourselves and our reach beyond the specific academic communities with our scholarship. So there's a push towards openness that comes from that desire to make oneself most flexible and available to the job market. And in the digital humanities, you have a lot of people coming in with an open source mentality to say sharing these things and getting our work out there is about releasing a sense of ownership in many ways, which of course is often the ideal and not the practice. But it's interesting to sort of witness that across the board as we're trying to figure out what are the steps moving forward to be published, to get our mark out there, but to also get a job at the end of the day. So.
Thank you. That was fantastic, and we will have plenty of time at the end, if it hasn't already been mentioned, for Q&A at the end of the session for our panelists in particular. So I'm going to be speaking for a bit now about our research at Ithaca S+R to help frame our conversation on scholar practices and perspectives. So as Danielle mentioned, the research we're going to be discussing is from Ithaca S+R, where the two of us work. Ithaca S+R is one of 4 service areas at Ithaca, which also houses JSTOR, Portico, and Art Store. And our mandate is really to provide strategic guidance and research for academic and cultural communities. And so the research we're going to be speaking about today falls under two main program areas, our surveys and our qualitative research. Through these projects, we really aim to provide actionable research for libraries, publishers, other related kinds of organizations. And one of our main areas of focus is scholarly communication. So these 2 project areas we'll be speaking about in just the next two slides here, our national faculty survey and our qualitative disciplinary deep dives, which Danielle leads. So for those of you who aren't or are less familiar with our national faculty survey, we survey scholars on a triennial basis, so every 3 years on their research, teaching, and publishing behaviors. In the 2018 survey cycle, we had nearly 11,000 responses from faculty members in a wide variety of fields. And so through this project, we track changes over time. There's a lot of value in the kind of longitudinal perspective that we can have on this kind of coverage. And then we also add new areas of focus each survey cycle. So in the 2018 survey cycle, we have new questions in this survey on open educational resources, on research, fraud, and fabrication, learning analytics, open access publishing, and probably a fifth topic that I've forgotten. So today we're going to really be focusing on the research practices and research dissemination end of it, but there is a public report of findings on all of these results that was released just last month, and I think there is a link to it on the back of the handout. So in addition to the kind of breadth that we're able to capture through a national survey like the faculty survey, we also conduct these disciplinary deep dives into the practices of scholars by field. These are large-scale qualitative studies conducted by Danielle and her team in conjunction with librarians and publishers to really deeply understand field-specific needs and also, as you can see from the bottom of the slide here, synthesize across disciplines. And so Danielle and I will be sharing research findings from both sets of studies that I've just discussed over the next couple of minutes. So I'm going to start out with one of the key findings from the 2018 faculty survey cycle, which is that, to Lisa's point about where behaviors and attitudes diverge, this is one area where we see that happening. Faculty are increasingly interested in an open access publication model, but traditional scholarly incentives continue to motivate their behavior. So we see this in a number of ways. We ask, for example, faculty members about where they're publishing their work. About 90% of them are doing so often or occasionally in peer-reviewed journals. Faculty members also very frequently publish conference proceedings, scholarly monographs, followed by working papers or preprints. And these findings are pretty consistent with what we saw in the previous survey cycle in 2015, so not a lot of movement here. And then considering where faculty are predominantly disseminating their research findings, it's perhaps unsurprising that the characteristics of scholarly journals that have historically been most highly valued really continue to be viewed as such and to motivate behavior accordingly. So I'll just read off a couple of these items. The items that really most highly influence faculty members in deciding where they're going to publish have to do with the area of coverage being close to their immediate area of research, the current issues being circulated widely and well read, and having a high impact factor or an excellent academic reputation. And what I want to note particularly on this slide is that consistent with previous survey cycle findings, faculty are relatively more concerned with not having to pay for publishing their own scholarship, more so than they are with others having to pay to access their scholarship. And to one of the comments about, generational differences versus, early career, later career researchers, we've broken down quite a number of the findings in this survey cycle by both age and title or role. And what we see here, breaking it down by age, is that relatively older, more senior faculty tend to be more concerned with characteristics that fall outside of those top three that I just mentioned, right? So these include an expeditious publishing timeline, high selectivity, protection and safeguarding for the long term, and so on. And particularly want to highlight here that older faculty tend to be more concerned with open access, very broadly speaking. Younger faculty have really well aligned their behavior to these top three. But then turning to attitudes, the story kind of comes together here. A couple of things. So first, faculty have displayed a notable increase in interest for an open access publication system since our last survey cycle. So these are the findings by age, but I'll just mention from 2015 to 2016, 2015 to 2018, we saw a substantial increase in the share of faculty who said that they would be happy to see the traditional subscription-based publication model replaced entirely by an open access system. And younger faculty, as you can see in that first item there, they've indicated a much higher interest than their older colleagues in replacing this model. About 70% of respondents strongly agreed with a newly added statement that they would be happy to see the same publishers stay involved in the open access model. And then looking at that third item, we see that older faculty are relatively less likely than their younger colleagues to shape their research outputs and publication choices to match the criteria that are seen as successful for tenure and promotion. This makes sense, suggesting that older faculty, perhaps who are more established, more tenured, may make their publications and findings open because the traditional scholarly incentives are not as relevant for them. And then very few faculty across the board feel that scholarly publishers have been rendered any less relevant than they have been previously. So between the attitudes and behaviors that we're seeing here, faculty increasingly report that they would be happy to have an open access publication system, but traditional scholarly incentives really continue to be a major driving force behind their behavior. And we heard this reflected. I pulled in a couple of quotes from the session yesterday, the panel with three scholars in a variety of fields. We heard this echoed from them as well, right? So there was a lot of emphasis in this session on traditional scholarly incentives continuing to motivate behavior, particularly for early career researchers. So Christine has just shared a series of findings on how scholars in the aggregate across a wide variety of fields are thinking through these issues. And I want to also highlight how these things can vary by field, with the reality that actually some of the most cutting edge work is where you find the most friction with these issues. So I chose Indigenous studies, which for those who are not familiar with this field, it is a very dynamic field. It's where one puts Indigenous perspectives at the center of the work. It is highly interdisciplinary, and you have folks working with a different kind of ethic towards their research. There's a much stronger emphasis on working with communities, doing it in a good way, so not being extractive. And this, therefore, ends up being something that they think about very much when it comes to scholarly communications. Now, I apologize because I really don't want to do this. The clicker from sorry. This turned out to be a slightly less awkward way to do this. So here is a field where they experience a lot of friction when it comes to scholarly communications in the traditional sense. From the project I did with them, there was a lot of speaking about peer reviewers and their lack of awareness of Indigenous methods and terminology, because these methods are often quite different than what you get in hegemonic Western research. And in fact, they're designed that way intentionally to really push back on the Western research approach. But when it comes to actually publishing their work, this is a problem because there's not necessarily the expertise in mainstream journals to be able to evaluate how they're doing their work adequately. And there are Indigenous studies-specific publications, but they're perceived as less prestigious. So this is a group of scholars who are really hoping to engage with the other fields that are relevant to their work. In terms of open access, this is the thing I really want to emphasize for this session because I think it brings a really interesting kind of perspective that you don't necessarily hear from other scholars. So Indigenous studies scholars do really care about sharing their work more widely. Once again, they see this as an ethic. They want to give back to the communities that they're working with because historically Indigenous folks have had things stolen from them. And yet at the same time, this is also a group that is less likely to be supportive of open access as it is conventionally defined. The rationale being that a lot of Indigenous knowledge is sacred, and therefore it cannot just be openly shared with everybody all of the time. So the default to open that you find in funding mandates in particular is really problematic for Indigenous studies scholars. So what I love about these scholars is they bring this other element to this discussion that you wouldn't necessarily hear when we're talking about this typically.
So pivoting a bit, next we're just going to talk for a few minutes about data set deposit, research fraud and fabrication. And we found in the most recent faculty survey that while faculty believe in the value, generally speaking, of others organizing and preserving their research data, they're more unsure if it's worth their time to do so. So we pose these two statements to faculty, one having to do with their own behavior and one having to do with the behavior of others. We see that about 60% of faculty view the organization and deposit of research data sets as broadly important, particularly when others are doing it. About a third strongly agree that the time it would take for them to deposit their own data is not worth it. Another 40% or so responded neutrally to this statement. So about 70%, totaling those up, don't really think necessarily that it's worth their time to do so. By discipline, we see, that scientists in particular have notably, we have notably higher shares of scientists indicating that this is both an important practice for others and an important practice for them to do themselves. And then regarding data fabrication, falsification, other types of research fraud, respondents appear to hold some concern on these issues, but don't necessarily agree that this is becoming increasingly prevalent, more of a problem over time. So less than 20% of respondents strongly agreed that they are not concerned. So many respondents are concerned. Less than 20% indicated that there are sufficient processes and protocols in place to prevent these. So there we see some concern expressed as well. Again, about 20% see this as increasingly prevalent, so maybe not more of an issue over time, but still an issue. And medical faculty in particular have responded to these statements in a way that displays relatively more concern. And then just lastly to the first item there, faculty really overwhelmingly, perhaps not surprisingly, believe in the value of defining both research questions and analyses plans prior to conducting research to improve the credibility of it. And I will hand it back over to Tanya.
So there are a lot of questions out there about the ways to be most effective in getting faculty to share their data, and a lot of questions about the extent to which that should be a function of scholarly communications or somehow part of another component of a research life cycle. We recently did a study on data sharing communities, and we learned that data sharing is a fundamentally social activity. We did this by looking at a number of groups that are doing this kind of work very successfully, organically. And in particular, we looked at the Cambridge Structural Database, Flybase, and DesignSafe CI. And what we found here is that essentially there is a mismatch between a lot of what the narratives are around getting data sharing to be more effective. There's a lot of talk about top-down approaches, in particular, funder mandates and the like, when in reality it is these organic communities that are typically fluid and informal, where data is already being shared quite successfully. We can see these communities taking place primarily on websites with a repository element, and they tend not to be organized around a particular discipline. They can be quite interdisciplinary, in fact. So what we learn from this is that when it comes to thinking about how to support this aspect of the research lifecycle, that it doesn't make sense to do it artificially by top-down approaches, and also the disciplinary organization is really problematic. And I think about this a lot at a conference like SSP, because I have the privilege of getting to speak with lots of folks who are associated with particular professional associations and have a variety of publications. And I think it's worthwhile to think about what it means to be encouraging data sharing in these contexts, when the reality is that the scholars are not doing it on a discipline by discipline basis.
So our next prompt, which is the second question on your handout, asks, how can Ithaca and our findings on these practices and perceptions help inform your work? We would encourage you to consider what findings surprised and didn't surprise you, what's most relevant to what you're thinking about in your own work, and what kind of additional research would be useful, and perhaps how could engaging more deeply or working more closely with scholars be beneficial. So I'm going to pause here for a couple of minutes. We'll give you a few minutes to jot down some thoughts. Then we'll hear from our panelists, and then we'll open for Q&A after that. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and hear from our panelists. We can go in the same or a different order. Yes.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. Pressure's off. You guys get a few extra minutes. So I had to restrain myself from looking back at the Ithaca S&R reports, in particularly because as I look at the data, I've actually been relying on the faculty survey for every year that they've done it. And I often eagerly anticipate the results, since the 2018 data doesn't come out till 2019, and we are forced to wait for a long time. The thing that I really am often struck by in this is this both conflict as well as the potential for interplay between beliefs, intentions, and actions. And I think about this a lot, just generally speaking, which is, what do we say we believe? What do we intend to do? And then what do we actually manage to accomplish? And as a scholar myself, there are times when I have a lot of beliefs. I hold a lot of values. There are a lot of things that I want to achieve, and those things sometimes come into conflict with each other. For example, I have a journal article that I think would be best placed in a gold APC only journal. So that would make me my public that I want, which would be to publish there. But I'm unfunded. And I'm at an institution that has no institutional funding to fund APCs. Nor did my direct dean of my faculty show any particular indication to just throw money my way. So what choices am I left with is going to my husband and saying, so that retirement account, I can have this value of open and this value of wanting my readers, and I'm going to place that article somewhere else. Because I'm going to have to weigh other values into this decision. So it might look like then my actions don't match my beliefs. I had good intentions. I tried hard, but I couldn't pull it off. So this other thing I think that we really have to take with this, and the way I try and think about this, is I think sometimes the strategies we use to engage our researchers are a mismatch, because we are treating them as if the problem is their action, and in reality, the misalignment is in their beliefs, or vice versa, that we are attempting to convince them on a belief level, and they're totally with us on a belief level, but they don't have the ability to enact those beliefs with their actions. And so as librarians or publishers, we have to really look at what the actual barrier to change is, whether it's a belief-based barrier or an action-based barrier, or in some cases, do different parts of the community have different barriers to change, and how do we align our strategies for advocacy with them with the particular barrier? So I think the other thing we can think about is the way scholars as one stakeholder community, and then the other stakeholder communities, whether they be the institutions that employ those scholars, the publishers that communicate their work, the librarians that subscribe to it, all these other stakeholders, the degree to which scholars' interests are aligned with institutional interests or other stakeholder interests. I think we have to admit that there are cases in what might be good for me as an individual scholar will be contrary to what would be in an institution's best interest, if you will. And so we can't only think about scholars' behaviors in the context of the systematic interests. We also have to look at those individual interests and where they might not be aligned at all. And so the individual scholar may be making very, very rational decisions through that individual analysis lens, even if it is contrary to what an institutional analysis lens might bring to that, which is where I think we can also say that we can see the development of conflict. The final thing I just have to say is I think the data community study is such a wonderful example of what I think is an interesting, what do we mean by open? So I suspect that when the FLY researchers have this system of passing this data around, they consider that data to be open, even though I cannot get access to that data, because the data is open to the community that needs it and generates it, and they don't mean publicly open. And that's usually what the rest of the community might be thinking about that. So I think it's a great example of where, going back to that first question you asked of like, what do they think about open access? I think they think of open as something very different than what we typically mean when we talk about it from a business model or a public mandate kind of open access.
And very briefly, I'll just dovetail off that. But the thing that was most striking to me about the Ithaca study, as just related to us, was that scholars, younger scholars, I think you said, are totally fine with journals moving from a subscription to an open access model, right? And I think it's because they just don't care about the business model. And they also said, yeah, there is something that suggests they trust the existing publishers they're working with, right? So, okay. So, I mean, they have implicit trust in publishers if you're a publisher out there. And I think it's about the relationship between the scholar and who they're publishing with, and the ability of publishers to get scholars' work out there in a way that they want it out there, right? And the other phrase that struck me was traditional scholarly incentives. We're talking about scholarly incentives from the perspective of belief and actions. And these incentives, we've talked a lot over this past couple of days about incentives governing publication models. And we don't talk a lot about books. I know that MLA a few years ago released a kind of white paper report advocating for a move away from books as the gold standard for tenure and promotion. And some institutions have done that, but guess what? Books are still around. Scholars still want to publish books. They still want to read books. And I think, meeting them where they are and giving them a range of options for how to publish and kind of stepping away a little bit from thinking about it just in terms of business models will help us be a little more creative in how we negotiate conflicts.
Okay. It's so interesting to hear you guys talk about this, because I think that as a scholar starting out, right, listening to the sort of faculty survey, listening to people who have great amounts of experience working with publishers. I work with University of Minnesota Press, and sort of listening to their perspective, and then working in the digital initiatives at the Graduate Center, sort of trying to understand the waters as I go. And I think that very often with my peers, it's that question of how do you what is professionalization, right? That we're in this sort of constant process of how do you professionalize and how do you make use of what's available. So the sort of findings that strike me as most relevant have to do with the open educational resources, because where I am now, I'm an adjunct professor at Brooklyn College, and that's something that's important to me, is like, how do I provide materials to my students that they can use, that they can get information from, that they don't have to work around. So I go between library subscriptions and all these things, and understanding publishing through that sort of like practical, where are the books? How are my friends getting books? Who's getting published? Who's getting tenure? And trying to like tackle that mountain of what is scholarly publishing, what is scholarly communication as a person starting out. You sort of have to like glom onto pieces of information where you can, and you join these different organizations to try to understand a little bit more. But it is this learning process. So trying to understand how the openness comes into play when you come and you're so idealistic and you're like, I want things to be open in a way that allows the free sharing of ideas, but not understanding the business. It's not even just the like, oh, someone else will figure that out. It's also just the like, what are the business models of open access? What is this whole thing about an embargo? I don't even understand. And to sort of like hear the like, oh, this person got tenure and how did they do it? And so it's a lot of that, trying to get the information from a lot of different places. And I think that for me, the Ithaca SNR report was very helpful because it sort of consolidated a lot of information that I had questions about. And I was like, oh, so there are other people thinking about these things, and what they do is different from what they think. And okay, I'm not alone in that. But it is that, I think it's largely this question of contingency, right? We talk about the contingent labor thing, but it's also our general sense of contingency when we are starting out, of how are we going to find our path through this while maintaining certain values and hopefully getting some ideas out there in whatever way we can. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. That was great. So I think we're going to open it up for Q&A now, particularly for our panelists, I hope. So if you have any questions, please go up to the mic, and we look forward to hearing your questions.
I'm wondering what you're hearing from researchers about their relationships with editors. As an editor, do they care about us at all? No. And if they do, what do they care? Is it only about speed, or are there other things that they're valuing? Thanks.
I'm sorry, whose relationship with editors exactly? Author's relationship with editors.
The author's relationships with editors. Yeah. Is that part of their decision making? Are they valuing those relationships? Is that part of the story important to them? Because a lot about what people have been talking about here is how do we speed up editorial? And I'm in a journal where it's a very high touch editorial, and I have very close relationships with my authors. They tell me they value that. I don't know if that, is something that people are seeing as well.
I can speak.
What's your field?
Yeah.
Like what's your journal? What's the journal?
Early modern humanities.
Okay.
Nice. Okay.
I can speak to it only from my perspective with PMLA, and we are not a fast-moving journal, although we do our best. We, the editors and the author, there's enormous mutual respect, is what I would say on the part. We do care deeply about author relationships, and the editors and the editorial board certainly value that. But we're one journal at an independently published scholarly society. So we may be more in simpatico than you may have been experiencing elsewhere throughout the past couple of days. I don't know, but that's just one journal, anecdotal.
I do want to say, though, that pretty much in every field I've studied, humanities, science, professional, yeah, speed is, that's it. Like, people want it to be faster, and can also talk from personal experience, which is it is quite demoralizing and frustrating when you are relying on your publication credits to be what gives you things in the academy, and you can't put them on your CV yet because it took 10,000 years for somebody to get back to you.
I'm Linny Argavray, a library graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was really interested to hear about Ithaca's findings about data communities aren't necessarily within the same discipline. So I was wondering if maybe with humanities specifically, but overall general maybe, how scholars might be able to then navigate data, finding data or placing data into repositories if they're not in specific disciplines.
So with the issue brief, we give a really good example from Flybase where we did something very simple where you can actually look up the scholars, and we just looked up everybody with the name John. We call him John McFly Guy. And yes, it is cross-disciplinary, but what is motivating the scholars in that respect is that they need to work with a certain kind of data for their research. So they have that underlying motivation to want to work with it and share it. In that case, it's the genetic information of a particular kind of fly that is very popular across different kinds of research. Now, in the humanities, it's a whole other story, and with the issue brief, it's not really focused on the humanities intentionally, because what we find in all of our studies on the humanities is that if you even try to ask people about how they're working with data, they just tell you they aren't working with data. So you have to be a lot more creative there in how you ask them about that. So that's the disjunction. How humanists find and work with data, that's a whole other story. In my dream world, I will one day do a study just on the humanists who are working on the cutting edge of data practices, because I will say that, the way that Ithaca studies are designed, we don't tend to focus on just the people that are at the cutting edge. We look at everyone, and pretty much with every humanities field, the subset of people who are even identifying as digital humanists is just like pretty minor.
Hi, John Maxwell from Publishing Studies at Simon Fraser University. I'm really interested in the author attitudes part of the survey, and I'm intrigued by how similar humanities, social sciences look on there, and I think there's interesting work to dig a lot deeper into that, into disciplines and subdisciplines, and the extent to which subdisciplines are served or less served by really strong societies. So I think there's a real disciplinary discipline in how junior scholars are raised up within strong society disciplines, as opposed to ones where there's a lot more kind of movement and that sort of thing. And so, just for answer to this question, that's what I'd really like to see.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I will share that, part of the faculty survey that got boiled down to a 5-minute presentation is that we partnered with 15 scholarly societies in sending out messaging to faculty in specific fields, and over the next 2 weeks we'll be meeting with all of them to talk about their field specific findings, right? So we're rolling up quite a lot of fields to the macro disciplines that you're seeing here, and we'll probably come out with some kind of short publication on some of those field-specific findings, because of course to your point, there is so much nuance that gets lost with these kinds of groupings, but are important for a variety of reasons. So I appreciate that.
That's great. I think that's part of the discourse that we need to come up. We have at Simon Fraser University, we have a open access policy and the working group with that, and the debates within that really broke down into, well, in my discipline there's Absolutely. This society, and these are how, this is how the dogma gets laid down, and in other disciplines where that isn't so strong, that really broke along those lines.
Sure.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Hi, Wayne Madison, Cold Spring Harbor. I'm a little late, so I'm apologizing in advance if this question was already covered in some way, but did preprints come up in terms of how people are viewing publication in humanities at all? It's big in the sciences, and it's been dramatically changing. I don't know if there's anything in the survey about that, or you had any thoughts?
So your question is preprints.
Preprints,
Do the
sorry.
humanists care? Is
Um,
that the question?
Not quite, but is it a factor? Would they?
I would say that even within the sciences, there's only certain fields where preprints are really on the agenda. There are just a few fields where it's very, very strong, physics. But even I'm always surprised the extent to which within a variety of sciences that preprint culture still really lags.
Yeah,
And then with the humanities, I have yet to do a study on humanists where anybody mentioned the term preprint or was displaying a behavior that even came remotely close to what we see in physics.
part of what it's grown quite a bit in biology in the last few years, obviously. Part of the reason I ask is
And we haven't done biology yet.
I understand. Oh, no. But I was wondering about humanities, partly asking because someone said about speed, rapidness, and that was one of the drivers.
But I will add that going back to this idea of data communities and having a community-centric approach to thinking about innovation. The reality is that physics is an archive, and what they've been doing there with preprints has been going on for a really long time and evolved organically. So it is not surprising to me that when I've seen the behavior in other fields lagging in this respect is because it's come about much more artificially as opposed to organically over time.
In biology, it was decades before it happened, and then all of a sudden it really took off. So I'm wondering if it may happen in humanities too.
So I think one thing we should sort of also think about, though, is speed we say that as if it's like one thing, but it's not. So
I took it in the sense of you're getting your work out if you're
right. Yeah. So that's why I want to unpack this a little bit, because there's speed in disseminating my claims, right? So like sort of that, like, I want to be able to share this research so that it can be built on, because there's this sort of the metaphor of like a building on the shoulders of giants. Like, one of the things I think is really fascinating, this would be like a great study, Danielle, let's do this together, which is to ask scholars about their metaphors for scholarship.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is Lisa's hypothesis, laying claim to it right now. Can somebody register this for me? That in fields that use the phrase building on the shoulders of giants, that is a metaphor that is more aligned with the idea of let's get a preprint out there so it can start to be worked with, and we can separate that from sort of the credentialing and when you can count in other ways.
Incremental research.
Right. As opposed to disciplines that have more of a metaphor that scholarship is an ongoing conversation. And like we don't have to like run to get the next conversation because it's
a monograph.
Well, no, it's a community-based concept, but the community is engaging it in a different way. So you don't have to get it out as a preprint in order for other people to start working with it. So when it starts to count, so this is the other time question. When in my discipline is putting it on my CV understood to say, yes, it's part of the discipline's discourse now?
So the goals are different.
Right. So also when I'm sort of, when I can say that this is now in the disciplinary discourse. So even if I put it out in the humanities and put it up on a website, whether that would be seen as now actually in the conversation as opposed to able to be built on. So I think there's a lot going on there that is much more about this notion of community of practice. Or epistemic community, that lots of different phrases we see in this social psychology area of understanding the ways that information is communicated, and information communication not entirely the same thing as publication.
Thank you very much.
So we only have time for one more question. Thank you for being the last.
Hi, my name is Adetomiwa Bashiru. I'm from Nigeria. I work with Redeemers University. I have two questions. The questions borders on impact factor and the assessment of scholars for promotion. In Nigeria, promotion of lecturers, scholars is majorly on publication. But recently, the agency regulated activities of universities, they are coming up with other things they can use. I know in developed countries like America, student assessment comes in when we come to promotion. But in Nigeria, it's majorly promotion, grants, and number of PhD you supervise. So I'm putting up to you now. Is there any other thing we can do that can take back home, that they can help the NUC, which is the Nigerian University Commission, that they can inculcate in assessing lecturers for promotion? Then, secondly, when we are talking in terms of impact factor, back home in Nigeria, I discovered that people in humanities, management science, they are disadvantaged in terms of impact factors, because most of the journals, because now most of the universities in Nigeria, they say you must publish in journal in high impact factors. The journals must be indexed in Scopus or Web of Science. And in humanities, they have fewer journals indexed in the Web of Science, Scopus. So what can we do just to balance the whole thing? Thank you.
Anyone else except me sitting on promotion and tenure committees?
No. Totally.
So I mean, I think what you raise is a very difficult question, right? So it is, in the abstract, sounds wonderful to say that what we should do every year is just read everyone's work that's in our department and then assess the quality. But in reality, we're always looking for proxies for these things, not the least of which is I might have an office next to another librarian, but they study metadata and I study information literacy. So they're not actually qualified to assess the quality of my scholarship. So we're looking for signals, and I think what you're pointing out is that when we go to choose our proxies, when we go to choose our signals, if we do not choose thoughtfully, we can inadvertently, hopefully not intentionally, but perhaps even then, put in places systems that are not sensitive to disciplinary field differences. And so this sort of uniform, it must always be indexed here. Well, maybe it should be indexed in MLA, the place that indexes the humanities. And so really thinking carefully, I think, ultimately about what systems we put in place, because those are the systems in which individuals will then have to make their decisions. And I mean, that going back to what I said before, if you want to align beliefs and actions, you have to make sure that you have a system that allows people to act on their beliefs. So I don't think I have a good solution for you. I think I think we all see the difficulties. I think in my own institution, we rely less on impact factor. And honestly, what I think a lot of our disciplines have are not an impact factor generally, but they have journal lists within their journals that they have developed. That can be for some scholars, though, as pernicious as impact factor. So not good solutions, but definitely greater clarity around the problems. But I think, as our very first keynote speaker at this conference pointed out to us, the global impact of some of these Western systems is really something that I think gives us pause collectively, but also perhaps if we are of the global North and the global West, we perhaps have an ethical obligation to think about what we can do to repair damage that was done inadvertently.
So thank you so much for attending. Once again, if you're curious about the research that we're doing, that's on the back of the form. And for those in various fields or want to talk further, we're always happy to, including that I would love to do a study on biology. Thanks again.
Thank you.